Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we are exploring a massive paradigm shift that completely changed how I view past and present relationships. We are going to be unpacking the hidden architecture of human connection. Honestly, I was absolutely fascinated to learn this because it challenges the foundational premise of pretty much everything we think we know about romance and attachment. In fact, we might just be scratching the wrong surface entirely. So, what if attachment is not actually about love? It's a pretty jarring question, right? But think about it. Have you ever wondered why you simply cannot let go of a specific person long after a relationship has ended? Or on the flip side, why some people inexplicably pull away the exact second intimacy gets real? Why do certain relationships feel so psychologically addictive? Like when you're obsessively staring at your phone just waiting for a single text message? Well, it's really easy to write all of that off as just intense love or, basic incompatibility. But there is a much deeper mechanism at play here. Okay, let's dive into this. Modern psychology has long told us that attachment is essentially about safety. But today, we're going way deeper than that. We are going to transition from that modern view of physical safety into the profound internal world of Carl Jung, the shadow, the persona, and a really fascinating concept known as identity completion theory. Because perhaps we aren't just attaching to people. Perhaps we are actually attaching to something inside of ourselves. To really wrap our heads around this, we first need to look at modern attachment theory. Developed by John Bowlby and Mary Ainsworth, this theory beautifully explains attachment as a sheer survival mechanism. You see, as children, our nervous systems are incredibly adaptable. We learn emotional equations very early on in life. Some of us are raised in environments where we learn that connection is completely safe, but others learn a very different equation. Maybe that asking for help leads to disappointment, or that a parent's closeness just feels totally overwhelming. Your body literally remembers these equations, and this deeply ingrained memory becomes your attachment style. That brings us to how these survival mechanisms actually manifest in adults. The anxious nervous system regulates itself through closeness, while the avoidant nervous system regulates itself through distance. Now, I want to be absolutely clear here. Neither of these systems is evil. Neither is broken. They are simply survival adaptations. They are brilliant biological ways your body learned to keep you safe. But as Carl Jung would point out, this nervous system response, that's really only the surface level of the story. What is super fascinating is how Carl Jung's concept of the persona layers perfectly over these attachment styles. Jung believed that our psyche builds protective identities, or personas. Think of the persona as a sort of protective social mask, designed specifically to help you survive and navigate the world. For those with avoidant attachment styles, they build a very specific, highly structured protective mask. The traits that make up this avoidant persona include high competence, serious emotional control, fierce independence, extreme self-sufficiency, and unshakable composure. And hey, these aren't inherently bad traits. In fact, these traits are exactly why avoidant individuals are often the very people getting promoted in professional and corporate environments. They're masters of their own domain, crushing their KPIs while keeping perfectly, effortlessly cool. But consider this stark contrast for a second. On one side, we see what work rewards: control, structure, predictability, and emotional restraint. The avoidant persona is built absolutely perfectly for this. But on the flip side, we see what love asks for. Love demands vulnerability. It demands emotional dependence, unpredictability, and mutual emotional influence. They are entirely different environments. This is exactly why the avoidant person's nervous system begins to absolutely panic when love asks for vulnerability. The environment of intimacy completely destabilizes the protective persona they've worked their entire lives to build. Because underneath that highly functional, composed persona lives what Carl Jung called the shadow. Now, it's not as spooky as it sounds. It's simply the rejected emotional self. It holds the vulnerable child, the deep fear of abandonment, an intense unmet need for closeness, and layers of hidden grief that have just been buried beneath control. When intimacy starts demanding vulnerability, it threatens to drag the shadow right out into the light. Suddenly, intimacy doesn't feel romantic at all to the avoidant person. It feels incredibly dangerous and profoundly destabilizing. This leads us to one of the deepest unconscious fears inside avoidant attachment. If intimacy becomes too real, the self-protecting me may collapse. Let's just pause to really absorb that, because it completely reframes how we view withdrawal in relationships. Actually, scratch that. Withdrawal is no longer just coldness or a lack of care or emotional absence. It is quite literally an act of identity preservation. And because the nervous system has never learned how to stay emotionally safe inside deep vulnerability, the psyche protects itself automatically. It acts almost like a heavy vault door slamming shut, utilizing distance, silence, emotional compartmentalization, and withdrawal. Avoidant people do not run away because they feel nothing. They run because they feel entirely too much, and the threat to their crafted identity is just overwhelming. It's an automatic, unconscious defense of the self. This deeper understanding of the self leads us directly to a radical psychological concept called identity completion theory. This theory proposes that attachment is not merely about interpersonal connection, it's actually about unfinished identity. The core truth here is that we attach to people because they unconsciously activate emotionally unfinished parts of ourselves. You can clearly see how this plays out in the unconscious survival beliefs of both styles. The anxious person unconsciously feels, when I am connected to you, I feel emotionally whole. For them, connection equals completion. The avoidant person, meanwhile, feels, if I depend on you too deeply, I may lose the identity protecting me. Both people are doing the exact same thing. They are simply trying to preserve their sense of self. One moves closer to survive, the other moves away to survive. And this brilliantly illustrates why letting go after a breakup feels psychologically impossible for so many people. When you lose the relationship, you aren't just grieving the other person. Your psyche is grieving an identity state. It's grieving an emotional possibility. And most importantly, it is grieving the unfinished part of yourself that finally came alive while inside that relationship. You are literally mourning a piece of your own identity. Which brings us to the infamous anxious-avoidant dance. These two types are famously magnetized to each other, creating a dynamic that is often incredibly painful for both sides. The anxious person seeks reassurance and absolutely fears abandonment, while the avoidant person seeks emotional control and fears engulfment. Together, they perfectly recreate each other's unfinished emotional architecture. The anxious person pursues because distance feels like identity fragmentation, and the avoidant withdraws because closeness feels like identity destabilization. So they become trapped in this endless loop. And listen, it is not because they are weak or foolish. It's because of this powerful reality. The nervous system mistakes unfinished emotional activation for destiny. Because the relationship hits every single unconscious trigger and survival mechanism so perfectly, the body falsely signals that this intense, exhausting, triggering dynamic is somehow meant to be. So, how in the world do we break the cycle? Well, healing requires stepping out of that loop, a process Carl Jung called individuation. Individuation happens when we stop using attachment to complete the self externally. It's about the internal integration of the hidden self, including the shadow, to achieve wholeness. Notice I said wholeness, for sure not perfection. It's just about bringing all those hidden pieces of yourself into the light. The path to that wholeness looks very different depending on your starting point. The anxious individual slowly learns, I remain whole even when connection fluctuates. Their identity is no longer dependent on the presence of another. Meanwhile, the avoidant individual slowly learns, vulnerability does not erase my identity. They discover they can let the mask slip without being utterly destroyed. Both sides learn that relationships aren't meant to complete us. They are simply mirrors, revealing the emotional architecture already living right inside us. To summarize this massive paradigm shift, we really have to recognize that human connection is driven by profound hidden systems. It's about survival, it's about identity preservation, it's driven by deep childhood memory, and above all, it's driven by our unconscious search for wholeness. Attachment, as it turns out, was perhaps never just about love. It is the ultimate journey of the self. So as we wrap up this explainer, I want to challenge you. Next time you're stuck on someone, stop asking, why am I so attached to this person? And instead ask yourself this far more powerful question. What unfinished part of myself came alive through them? Thank you so much for joining me today to explore the emotional architecture of attachment. If this explainer resonated with you and gave you a new lens on your own behavior, be sure to subscribe, and I will see you next time as we continue to decode the hidden systems of human behavior.